His hands trembled every single time I crossed the threshold of that small hospital room, a room that had become a world of its own, filled with shadows and the low hum of machines. I could see the way his eyes flickered to the door, searching for escape, his breath catching in his chest as if he expected something terrible every time I appeared. The monitors would beep a little faster, betraying the storm inside him, and I could almost hear his heart pounding louder than any machine. There was a heaviness in the air, thick with the scent of antiseptic and the quiet desperation that clings to the walls of every hospital. I've walked through countless rooms like this, felt the weight of so many stories pressing against my skin, but there was something different about him, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, that made me pause before I spoke, before I reached out to adjust his blanket or check his IV. For days, I watched him. I watched the way his hand shook, the way his gaze darted away from mine, the way he seemed to shrink into himself whenever I tried to offer comfort. I wondered what kind of pain could make a grown man, someone who looked like he'd seen his share of hard times, so afraid of a nurse's gentle touch. I wondered what memories haunted him, what ghosts kept him awake at night, clutching his pillow as if it were a lifeline. I've seen fear before, of course. I've seen men and women broken by illness, by loss, by the slow unraveling of hope. But this was different. This was fear that ran deep, fear that had roots tangled up in something I couldn't see. Sometimes, late at night, when the halls were quiet and the world outside seemed far away, I would sit by his bedside and just listen to the sound of his breathing. I would watch the way his fingers curled around the edge of his pillow, white-knuckled and desperate, as if he was holding on for dear life. I tried to talk to him, to coax a smile or a word, but most days he just stared at the ceiling, lost in a place I couldn't reach. I wanted to help him, to ease whatever burden he was carrying, but I didn't know how. All I could do was be there, steady and patient, hoping that one day he would let me in. It's strange, the things we carry with us. Some people hold on to hope, to faith, to the memory of better days. Others carry regret or anger or secrets too heavy to share. I've learned after all these years that you can't always see the wounds that hurt the most. Sometimes they're hidden deep inside, wrapped up in silence and shame. Sometimes they're tucked under a pillow, safe from the world's eyes. I thought I'd seen every kind of pain there was, every way a heart could break, but nothing had prepared me for what I would find in that room, or for the lesson it would teach me about fear, forgiveness, and the fragile ways we hold on to hope. One quiet morning, as the sunlight slipped pale and gentle across the tile floor, I finally saw what he kept hidden under his pillow. My name is Ruth, and I've spent a lifetime walking these halls, tending to wounds both seen and unseen. I've held hands through the long nights, whispered prayers into the darkness, and watched as miracles unfolded in the most unlikely places. But that morning, as I stood at the edge of his bed and reached for the pillow, I realized there are still mysteries in this world, still moments that can shake even the most seasoned soul. What I found beneath that pillow changed everything I thought I knew about fear, about kindness, and about the quiet courage it takes to let someone in. And as I stood there, holding that secret in my hands, I understood that sometimes the greatest healing begins not with medicine, but with the simple act of seeing someone, truly seeing them, and letting them know they're not alone. That day, the hospital felt heavier than usual. Sometimes you walk in and it's just another shift, another sea of faces and charts and soft, tired voices. But other days, the walls seem to remember every sorrow and every joy that's passed through. It was early spring, and there was still a bite in the air, slipping in through the cracks around the window frames. I'd started my shift just as the sun was setting, the last gold light stretching down the long hallway of Ward 2B, painting everything in warm, forgiving colors. The floors were polished, but even that shine couldn't hide the scuff marks from years of hurried steps and rolling gurneys. The hospital is never truly quiet, you know. There's always a distant cough, the shuffle of feet, the gentle squeak of rubber soles on linoleum. The kind of sounds you only notice when you've been listening for decades, when you've come to know the rhythm of a place that never really sleeps. That night, I was working with Donna, a nurse whose laugh could fill a room and whose patience seemed endless, and Kevin, a young nursing assistant with kind eyes and nervous hands. We all had our rounds, our little rituals, but I always made time for the patients who lingered at the edges, the ones who didn't get many visitors, whose families lived too far away, or who'd simply run out of people to call. There's something about the end of a hallway, the rooms where the light doesn't quite reach, that draws me in. Maybe it's because I know what it's like to feel forgotten. Maybe it's just the stubborn part of me that refuses to let anyone slip through the cracks. That's how I came to spend so much time with William. He'd been admitted just a few days before, quiet and withdrawn, his chart a tangle of medical terms and history that told me little about the man himself. The doctors had written him up as stable, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he flinched when anyone came too close. He was older, with thinning hair and eyes the color of old denim, and there was a sadness about him that made me ache. His room was neat, almost bare, except for the pillow he hugged tight each night and a battered photograph on the nightstand. One of those old black and white snapshots, the kind you can tell has been handled 1,000 times. The other patients in Ward 2B had their own stories, of course. In the room across the hall, Jean always asked about her cat at home, her voice thin but determined. Down the corridor, Carl liked to joke with the staff, pretending he didn't care about anything, but the truth was he missed his late wife more than he let on. It's those small details that stay with you after so many years, the way someone folds a blanket, the smell of peppermint candies in a drawer, the photograph tucked into a book. These are the things that make a hospital feel less like a place of endings and more like a patchwork of lives stitched together by hope and memory. That evening, as I checked William's vitals, I tried to smile, tried to let him see that I wasn't there to hurt or judge. I asked if he needed anything, but he just shook his head, barely meeting my eyes. There was a tremor in his hands I couldn't ignore, a fear I knew wasn't just about illness. I wanted so badly to offer him comfort, but sometimes the hardest part of this job is knowing when to speak and when to simply be present. That night, as I made my way down the hallway, pausing to glance in on my other patients, I found myself thinking about William more than usual. Something about him, something about that room, felt unfinished, like a story waiting to be told. I remember standing by the window in the break room for a moment, watching the city lights flicker in the distance, thinking about all the lives unfolding inside these walls. The nurses and doctors moved through their routines, but every now and then someone would pause, look up, and share a quiet word or a tired smile. It's in those small moments that you remember why you chose this life. Not for the glory or the thanks, those are rare, but for the chance to be a witness to the most honest parts of being human. Little did I know how much that night would change the way I see pain and the way I understand the quiet, desperate ways people try to protect themselves from the world. After so many years walking these halls, you learn to see past the surface, to notice the smallest things that others might miss. Sometimes it's the way a patient's breathing shifts when you enter, or how their hands linger at their sides, uncertain if they should reach out or retreat. With William, it was all of that and more. His fear wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, almost polite, as if he didn't want to inconvenience the world with his pain. But I could feel it every time I stepped inside that room. The air seemed to thicken, his eyes darted to the window, and his hands gripped that pillow like it was a piece of driftwood keeping him afloat in a sea of sorrow. I tried to make myself small, gentle. I told him about the flowers blooming outside the hospital entrance, about the nurse who brought in cookies she'd baked with her granddaughter, hoping something would soften that wall he'd built. Sometimes he'd nod, sometimes he'd just stare out the window, as if searching for a memory he'd lost. I kept my voice low and warm, careful not to rush him, careful not to let my own frustration slip through. It's a strange thing, holding your own feelings back so you can carry someone else's. But it's what we do, isn't it? We hold space, we wait, we hope. Donna noticed too. She caught me lingering outside his door, my chart pressed to my chest, and gave me that look, half concern, half encouragement. "He'll come around," she whispered one evening, her hand on my arm. "Sometimes they just need more time." Kevin was less sure. He was new, still learning the way pain can fold itself into silence. He asked if he should help, if there was something he could do, but I told him no, not yet. This was something William had to do in his own time, in his own way. "We all have our secrets," I said, "and sometimes the best medicine is just letting someone know you're there, even if they can't accept it right away." The days blurred together the way they always do in a hospital. Shift after shift, meal after meal, the light outside changing, while inside the clock seemed to stand still. I brought William his medications, checked his IV, fluffed his pillow, and every time I tried to find a new way to reach him. I asked about the photograph on his nightstand, a faded image of a little boy with a gap-toothed smile, but he only said, "That's my son," and nothing more. There was so much left unsaid in that sentence, a lifetime of stories hiding just beneath the surface. I wanted to ask about the boy, about what happened, but I could see how tightly William held his memories, how afraid he was to let them breathe. Still, I kept trying. I brought him tea instead of coffee, remembering that small detail from his chart. I made sure the curtains were open during the day so he could see the sky, even if it was cloudy. I told him about Jean's daily updates on her cat, about Carl's stubborn jokes, about the little community we'd built in Ward 2B, hoping he might feel less alone. Sometimes I imagined what it would be like if someone did all that for me, if I were the one lying in that bed, afraid and uncertain. It's humbling, realizing how much we all need each other, even if we're too proud to admit it. Nights were the hardest. The hospital grew quiet, the world outside faded, and the only sounds were the beeps and sighs of old machines. I would find myself sitting by William's bed, watching him pretend to sleep, his face creased with unspoken worries. I wondered what haunted him so deeply, what he feared I might see if he let his guard down. I wondered if he'd always been this way, or if something had happened to make him so afraid. We all have our breaking points, our moments when the world becomes too much. I've had mine too, though I rarely speak of them. Maybe that's why I felt so drawn to William, because I recognized a kind of loneliness in him that I've known myself. If you're listening to me right now, maybe you felt that way too. Maybe you've been the one holding on, hoping someone notices how hard you're trying. I'd love to know, where are you listening from? Has there ever been a time when you wanted someone to see past your silence? Leave me a comment and tell me a little about yourself. Sometimes sharing even the smallest piece of our story can make the world feel less lonely. And if you're out there holding on, just remember, someone is always willing to listen, even if it's just an old nurse like me. Sometimes in this line of work, you can sense a shift in the air before anything actually happens. That morning began like so many others. Medication rounds, soft chatter at the nurse's station, the aroma of old coffee lingering in the break room. Yet as I walked down the hallway toward William's room, a heaviness pressed on my chest, a feeling I'd learned never to ignore. It was as if something inside me knew that this day would not pass quietly, that the questions hanging between us would finally demand their answers. When I entered his room, William was sitting upright in bed, eyes fixed on the window, jaw clenched, knuckles white against the pillow he hugged to his chest. He was trembling more than usual, and I could hear the ragged edge in his breath, the almost inaudible whimper that escaped when he thought I wasn't paying attention. I tried to steady my own hands as I checked his chart, feeling the weight of every silent plea in his eyes. Fear can settle in a room, make everything feel fragile and uncertain. The sun was barely up, casting a watery light across the tile, and for a moment the world shrank to just the two of us. I asked William if he was in pain, but he shook his head quickly, too quickly, as if he was afraid of what might happen if he let any word slip out. I sat in the chair beside his bed, careful to keep my voice low and gentle, telling him about Jean's latest story of her mischievous cat, about Donna's plans for her granddaughter's birthday. But my stories just floated in the air between us, unanswered. I noticed then that William's hands were shaking so much he could barely hold his cup of tea. I offered to help, but he pulled away, almost as if my touch would burn him. There was terror in his eyes, not the kind you see when someone's worried about their diagnosis, but something older, deeper, and more personal. I watched him for a long moment, my heart aching for the man in front of me, and for whatever had left him so broken. It's not easy seeing someone unravel right before your eyes, knowing that all your training, all your experience might not be enough. But I've learned that sometimes the only thing you can do is bear witness, be the quiet anchor when someone else is lost at sea. As the morning wore on, William's distress only grew. The trembling in his hands became more pronounced, and his breaths came short and sharp, like he was fighting back a memory he couldn't control. Even the doctor's gentle questions seemed to make William retreat further into himself. Donna came by to check on me, her eyes full of concern, and Kevin hovered at the door, uncertain if he should step in. The air in the room was thick with worry, so much so that I could barely breathe. For the first time in a long while, I felt truly helpless, as if all the years I'd spent tending to wounds and soothing fears counted for nothing in the face of this silent, invisible pain. Then, just before noon, something changed. William's breathing became shallow, his eyes wide with panic as he pressed the pillow even tighter to his chest. I moved to his side, trying to calm him, my own voice trembling as I told him he was safe, that I was there, that nothing bad would happen while I was with him. He stared at me, his lips moving soundlessly, and then a single tear slipped down his cheek. I reached for his hand, not to take the pillow away, but just to let him know I was there. And for the first time, he didn't pull away. He let me hold his hand, let me feel the desperate, pleading strength in his grip. It was a small thing, but in that moment, it felt like the bravest act either of us could have managed. That was the turning point. The moment I realized that whatever William was holding on to under that pillow, it wasn't just an object. It was a shield, a lifeline, maybe even a secret that had kept him afloat through whatever storms he'd weathered before coming here. I could see the exhaustion in his face, the way his body sagged with relief and terror all at once. I sat with him for a long time, neither of us speaking, just letting the silence fill the room. Sometimes words get in the way. Sometimes all someone needs is to know that they're not alone in their fear. What I didn't know then was that what William hid under his pillow would soon be revealed, and with it, the truth about the pain he'd been carrying alone for so long. There are nights in this profession when you feel the floor shift beneath your feet, and this was one of them. Even before the sun had crested the city, I sensed the air thick with something unspoken as I made my way to William's room. He was sitting up, clutching that old pillow even tighter, his frame trembling, his gaze locked on the window as if hoping the dawn itself might offer escape. I greeted him softly and noticed his hands, shaking so hard he could barely keep hold of his cup. When I offered to help, he recoiled, his breath hitching, fear radiating from him like heat off asphalt. It wasn't just a patient's nervousness. It was a fear that lived deep, born of wounds I couldn't see. I tried to anchor myself, recalling all the years I'd soothed suffering with nothing but my presence and a steady voice. The morning drifted by with William growing more agitated. The doctor's visit, meant to reassure, only made him shrink further into himself. Donna, always hopeful, peeked in with a reassuring smile, while Kevin hovered at the threshold, unsure if he should intervene. The room's atmosphere seemed to thicken. The gentle beeps of machines, the filtered sunlight, my own heart thudding in quiet worry. I told William stories about Jean's cat, about Carl's stubborn jokes, but my words fell like feathers on stone, unable to soften the burden he carried. I wondered if he saw me as just another invader, or if he sensed the genuine ache in my heart to reach him. It was just before noon when the storm inside him broke open. He pressed the pillow so fiercely to his chest that his knuckles whitened, his breathing shallow and rapid, panic twisting his face. I moved to his side, my own nerves frayed, and reached for his hand, not to pry the pillow away, but to anchor him to the present, to let him know he wasn't alone. For the first time, he didn't recoil. He let my fingers wrap around his, let out a single silent tear. We sat like that for what felt like an eternity, him gripping my hand as if it were the only solid thing left in his world. That moment changed everything. I realized then that the pillow wasn't just a comfort, and whatever he hid beneath it was more than an object. It was a lifeline, a shield against the world's cruelties. I could sense the exhaustion in him, the years of carrying a secret too heavy for one soul. There were no words left, only the quiet understanding that sometimes the kindest thing we can offer is simple presence. I stayed with him until his breathing slowed and the wild fear in his eyes faded to a weary calm. In that fragile peace, I understood. We all have our hidden burdens, and sometimes the bravest act is letting another person witness them. But the day didn't let us rest there. Not long after, a code was called 2 rooms down, and I had to leave William's side, my heart torn between duty and the fragile trust we'd just built. I rushed to help, hands steady from years of practice, but mind still half in William's room, half with the patient fighting for breath down the hall. When I returned, William was still gripping that pillow, but his eyes followed me, searching for reassurance. I squeezed his hand once more, promising silently that I'd be back. The rest of the shift passed in a blur of alarms, medications, and whispered prayers. Each time I checked on William, I saw a little less fear and a little more hope, just a flicker, but enough to remind me why I keep coming back, night after night, year after year. If you find yourself holding something too heavy to carry alone, or if you've ever sat beside someone in their darkest hour, you know how much it means to have a hand to hold. If you've been there on either side of that silence, please subscribe and share your experience below. We're all just trying to find a little light together, and sometimes the smallest act of kindness can be the thing that saves us both. When the storm finally broke, there was a hush that settled over the room, the kind of fragile peace that only comes after a heart's silent battle. I stayed with William for as long as my duties would allow, my hand in his, feeling the tension slowly ebb from his thin fingers. He didn't speak, but there was a quiet surrender in his eyes that I'd come to recognize over the years, the look of someone who has let themselves be cared for, even if only for a moment. It's a small miracle, really, to witness that change, to know you've reached through the fog of someone's pain and offered them a lifeline. I've learned that healing is rarely loud or dramatic. Most times, it happens in silence. A gentle touch, a steady presence, the simple grace of being seen. The rest of that day was a blur of alarms and interruptions. A code blue down the hall forced me to leave William's side, my mind torn between the patient gasping for air and the man I'd just begun to reach. When I returned, I found William sitting up, pillow still clutched to his chest, but his eyes followed me now. There was something different in his gaze. Not the wild fear of the morning, but a searching look, as if he was trying to decide if he could trust me again. I gave him a reassuring squeeze and promised silently that I would always come back. It's a promise I've made to many and broken only by forces beyond my control. Throughout the afternoon, I checked on him as often as I could. Each time, the trembling in his hands seemed a little less severe, and he even managed a faint, grateful smile when I adjusted his blanket. Donna stopped by with her usual warmth, and Kevin, still learning the ways of compassion, offered to sit with William if I needed another pair of hands. It reminded me how healing is a team effort built on small acts of kindness and patience. The community of Ward 2B felt closer that day, bound together by the quiet struggle of one man and the unspoken support of those around him. As dusk settled and the corridors grew quiet except for the distant hum of machines, I sat with William one last time. The window was cracked open, and a cool breeze carried the faintest scent of newly mown grass. He didn't say much, but he met my eyes and nodded, a gesture that said more than words ever could. There's a sacredness in these moments that I can't explain to anyone who hasn't lived it, and understanding that the real work of healing happens in the spaces between words, in the trust that's built slowly, breath by breath. That night, as I finished my rounds and the hospital lights dimmed, I found myself thinking about all the patients I'd cared for over the years. Some had left with healed bodies, others with only a little more peace than they'd arrived with. But every one of them had taught me something about the quiet courage it takes to keep going. William, with his silent suffering and his stubborn grip on that pillow, reminded me that sometimes the hardest battles are the ones no one else can see. And yet, even those battles can be eased by kindness, by patience, by the willingness to simply sit with someone in their pain. What William was holding under that pillow still hadn't been revealed, but something in him had shifted. The fortress he'd built had a window now, and maybe, just maybe, he was ready to let a little light in. I left his room that night with a quiet hope I hadn't felt in a long time, grateful for the reminder that every soul, no matter how wounded, can be reached with patience and love. If this story reminds you of a moment when you were someone's anchor, or when you needed one yourself, subscribe and share your story. We're all in this together, and sometimes the smallest gesture is what makes all the difference. When the storm finally broke, there was a hush that settled over the room, the kind of fragile peace that only comes after a heart's silent battle. I stayed with William for as long as my duties would allow, my hand in his, feeling the tension slowly ebb from his thin fingers. He didn't speak, but there was a quiet surrender in his eyes that I'd come to recognize over the years, the look of someone who has let themselves be cared for, even if only for a moment. It's a small miracle, really, to witness that change, to know you've reached through the fog of someone's pain and offered them a lifeline. I've learned that healing is rarely loud or dramatic. Most times it happens in silence, a gentle touch, a steady presence, the simple grace of being seen. The rest of that day was a blur of alarms and interruptions. A code blue down the hall forced me to leave William's side, my mind torn between the patient gasping for air and the man I'd just begun to reach. When I returned, I found William sitting up, pillow still clutched to his chest, but his eyes followed me now. There was something different in his gaze, not the wild fear of the morning, but a searching look, as if he was trying to decide if he could trust me again. I gave him a reassuring squeeze and promised, silently, that I would always come back. It's a promise I've made to many and broken only by forces beyond my control. Throughout the afternoon, I checked on him as often as I could. Each time, the trembling in his hands seemed a little less severe, and he even managed a faint, grateful smile when I adjusted his blanket. Donna stopped by with her usual warmth, and Kevin, still learning the ways of compassion, offered to sit with William if I needed another pair of hands. It reminded me how healing is a team effort, built on small acts of kindness and patience. The community of Ward 2B felt closer that day, bound together by the quiet struggle of one man and the unspoken support of those around him. As dusk settled and the corridors grew quiet, except for the distant hum of machines, I sat with William one last time. The window was cracked open, and a cool breeze carried the faintest scent of newly mown grass. He didn't say much, but he met my eyes and nodded, a gesture that said more than words ever could. There's a sacredness in these moments that I can't explain to anyone who hasn't lived it, an understanding that the real work of healing happens in the spaces between words, in the trust that's built slowly, breath by breath. That night, as I finished my rounds and the hospital lights dimmed, I found myself thinking about all the patients I'd cared for over the years. Some had left with healed bodies, others with only a little more peace than they'd arrived with. But every one of them had taught me something about the quiet courage it takes to keep going. William, with his silent suffering and his stubborn grip on that pillow, reminded me that sometimes the hardest battles are the ones no one else can see. And yet, even those battles can be eased by kindness, by patience, by the willingness to simply sit with someone in their pain. What William was holding under that pillow still hadn't been revealed, but something in him had shifted. The fortress he'd built had a window now, and maybe, just maybe, he was ready to let a little light in. I left his room that night with a quiet hope I hadn't felt in a long time, grateful for the reminder that every soul, no matter how wounded, can be reached with patience and love. If this story reminds you of a moment when you were someone's anchor, or when you needed one yourself, subscribe and share your story. We're all in this together, and sometimes the smallest gesture is what makes all the difference. And as I walked out into the cool night air, I realized that the work we do isn't just about medicine or procedures. It's about the moments we choose to stay, the hands we choose to hold, and the hope we choose to nurture in the quietest corners of the world. That's what keeps me coming back, year after year, shift after shift, believing that even the smallest kindness can change a life. You know, it took me years to understand that some stories don't get happy endings, just honest ones. The day I finally saw what William hid under his pillow, I realized that truth with a force that left me breathless. The morning was quiet, the kind of gentle, golden light that makes you believe, if only for a moment, that all the suffering in the world might be put on hold. I had gone in to check his IV, expecting the same silence, the same fragile trust that had slowly blossomed between us. But this time, William's eyes met mine, and there was no fear, just a plea, soft and tired. For the first time, he lifted that battered pillow, hands trembling, and revealed a small, creased drawing. A child sketch, faded with age, of a little boy holding hands with a man. On the back, a single word in shaky handwriting, "Forgive." I remember my heart aching as I realized what that picture meant. It was his son, lost years ago to a tragedy William couldn't bring himself to speak aloud. All those nights clutching the pillow, all those fearful glances, were the weight of guilt and memory pressing down on his soul. He told me, haltingly, how he blamed himself, how he'd carried that loss like a stone in his chest, never allowing anyone close enough to help him set it down. I listened, holding his hand, feeling the hot sting of my own tears. Decades of nursing had taught me how to hold space for pain, but there was something about William's story that pierced straight through all my old armor. We talked for a long time. His voice was thin, sometimes barely more than a whisper, but the words came, one by one, like drops of rain after a drought. He spoke of love and regret, of the things he wished he could change, and of the hope that maybe, just maybe, forgiveness was possible, even if only from himself. I told him about my own losses, the nights I'd sat at bedsides haunted by words unsaid. In that little room, we became two souls, stripped of every role in uniform, just human beings reaching for a bit of light. After that day, William no longer shook when I entered. He still held the picture, but he also started to let others in, accepting Donna's jokes, Kevin's shy kindness, even joining the quiet laughter that sometimes floated down the hall from Jean or Carl. He would never be the same, but I like to think he found some measure of peace. I certainly did. I learned that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is let their pain be seen and their story be heard. I wish I could tell you that William's story ended with a miracle, but the truth is, healing is rarely so simple. There were good days and hard days, moments of laughter, and moments when the weight of memory pressed down again. But there was a gentleness in him now, a willingness to reach out, to accept a hand or a smile. That's what I've come to believe matters most. Not the erasing of pain, but the sharing of it. We carry each other, in small ways, every day. If you've listened this far, thank you for letting me share this piece of my heart. Life is full of burdens we can't see and wounds that take a lifetime to heal. But in the end, I believe the real miracles come from the courage to trust, to forgive, and to let a little light find its way through the cracks. Take care of each other, and never forget, a gentle word or a quiet hand can change a life. From one old nurse to anyone listening, keep hoping, keep loving, and remember, no one is truly alone.